Let's talk about ATP. So ATP is oftentimes defined as the energy currency of the cell. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. So adenosine triphosphate starts off as an adenosine group. So this right here is an adenosine group. The adenosine group will then have a phosphate group. So this is our phosphate attached to it, or covalently bonded to it rather. And so what we have now here, you have one phosphate, therefore you have adenosine monophosphate. The adenosine monophosphate will then have other phosphates attached to it, and we'll end up with adenosine triphosphate. So let's see how that happens. So here's AMP. I'm going to just refer to adenosine this way. So here is our adenosine, and we have our first phosphate on it. And now we're going to add yet another phosphate on. So now we have two phosphates, 1 and 2. So what we have here is adenosine diphosphate because there are two phosphates. And we're going to add yet another phosphate. And so now we have adenosine triphosphate, right? Because now you have 3 phosphate groups. So how can the cell get energy from this ATP molecule? Well, let's just take a look at what's happening here. You've got all these phosphate groups, and we've got these oxygens, and oxygen, as we know, always has those lone pairs of electrons, right? Electrons that are not taking part in the covalent bonding. And so what do we have all around this phosphate, all these phosphates? All these phosphates have lots of oxygens. Lots of these oxygens are going to have lots of these lone pairs of electrons that you see in red here. And we know from talking about it in class, when you have lots of these electrons, these are all going to be obviously negatively charged, so you have lots of electron repulsion, or you have lots of charge repulsion, right? So ATP is a molecule that has a lot of internal electron repulsion occurring. And what do we know about when you have all this electron repulsion? Clearly that the molecule is going to be strained, right? It's going to be strained. And so what happens then when I break this bond here and I release this phosphate group? And it gets released as something called inorganic phosphate, and it's written this way, and it's just this phosphate that is now not attached to an organic group, so it gets released as an inorganic phosphate. But when you release this phosphate, the releasing of the phosphate, by the way, is called hydrolyzing. Right? When I hydrolyze ATP, it means that I'm breaking this covalent bond and you're releasing this phosphate group. So when you release that phosphate group, what happened? ATP has lots of this electron repulsion happening. Now if I hydrolyze this phosphate and I'm now ADP, you have less electron repulsion, right? Because you've lost that phosphate group. So when you go from ATP to ADP, to ADP, you go from a molecule that was relatively more unstable because of all the electron repulsion to now a molecule that is more stable, right? So it's more stable, right? Because it has fewer electrons around it, so there's less electron repulsion with ADP. So what happens? What happens when you go from something that's unstable to stable? You have the release of our free energy, right? And so that's how cells are going to use ATP as a currency of energy within it, because it's going to hydrolyze that third phosphate group. It's going to get free energy in that process, and it's going to use that free energy. Now, what happens when you go from ADP to AMP? you're going to release free energy. Why? Because ADP, while it's more stable than ATP, it's less stable, obviously, than AMP because it has two phosphate groups. So you have free energy released. And so ADP then can also be used as a form of energy. With that said, it's actually ATP that is the major currency. ADP isn't as used. It's usually ATP. So that's how ATP gets used as an energy currency or molecule from which cells can get energy from. And so cells are going to go through a lot of processes to create ATP, right? So everything you eat, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, eventually the last step of the digestive processes of these macromolecules is going to be to create ATP, because that's how the cell is going to have energy in order to do all that it needs to do. All as in go through cell division, maybe repairing, go through making larger molecules and so forth. So all of these processes, as we know, requires energy. And that energy is going to come from hydrolyzing this ATP. And therefore, we're going to talk about in class, in metabolism lecture, how ATP is made. Okay? I hope this helps.